Hello and welcome to the Quarantined Wargamer. I'm Big Lee, and today I want to talk about why I think museums are worth their weight in reference books. So if you've ever read my blog, you'll know I visit quite a lot of museums, so it won't come as much surprise to you to learn that I heartily recommend visiting museums as a source of research when you're doing your wargaming and particularly your painting. So I do think that they are more than worth their weight in reference books, being able to visit a good museum, and this video is basically going to discuss why I think that. But it's first worth starting off by saying that the UK has a strong military tradition and therefore has a lot of military museums to choose from. I mean, we have some very large, world-renowned collections like the Tank Museum at Boverton, one of my personal favourites, and also lots of small regimental museums, sometimes attached to other museums or part of libraries, but they exist and maybe not open as much as the bigger museums, but are well worth visiting in their own right. Now, one of the main reasons why I would recommend visiting a museum, because they can be a great source of inspiration and therefore motivation when you're starting a new project, or indeed if you're trying to find something new to work on an existing one. And sometimes it can be the small objects, not just the large pieces, that can be the most inspiring. So while it's good to go and see large pieces of equipment, vehicles, large items of uniform and other pieces of kit, sometimes it can be really small items that really inspire you. Now, a couple of good examples that I can just pick off the top of my head would be the Royal Engineers Museum in Chatham has Lieutenant Chard's revolver from Rorke's Drift. An actual tangible link to a battle that was quite impressive to see, had a nice little history with it, a bit of information, and it was quite inspiring to see that and a lot of the other stuff that they had there to do with that particular period. And another one, which is a strange one perhaps because it probably won't feature much in your games, but the Imperial War Museum at Duxford has the Land Warfare Hall, and they have some really interesting stuff there, including Monty's hat, for instance, along with the badges and you've seen in 1,000 photographs, well worth seeing and very inspiring. And of course there are larger objects, such as being able to climb inside a First World War tank at Boverton, or standing in a section of a Horsa glider, where you finally get to see just how cramped it was and how basic it was. And you touch the walls and you think, that's wood, there's no protection there. These sort of things really put you in the place of the soldiers that we're representing on our table and can be really interesting. Other museums might have collections going back over further periods back in time. So for instance, I saw some original armour and weapons from Punic Wars and earlier Hellenistic period while I was on holiday a couple of years ago, and that was quite interesting to see an original helmet. Obviously you can always find a reference photo online, but to see it with your own two eyes is quite impressive and quite inspiring. Another example would be a reproduction of the mural of Ramesses defeating the Hittites in his chariots, for instance. There was, going back many years, went to Egypt, and there was a reproduction building in an original style with this mural across the whole of the building. It was absolutely massive. It must have been 30 or 40 foot high and a good 100 foot long. And although it was a replica, obviously, it was still quite impressive, and because it was all painted the way it would have been, it really gave an impression of what those buildings would have looked like at the time. And of course itself, it's quite an impressive mural. So again, not just original articles, but sometimes reproductions that you can see in museums can be very inspiring, and to see them for yourself rather than in a photograph is always better, I think. The thing about these little items, or even the big items in the terms of the building, is they can create a very personal link between you and a particular period that you're researching, or a battle, or even a person. It's something that you can't always get just by reading the book. Now, of course, the other major thing that you can get when you go to a museum is photographs. You know, most museums do allow you to take photographs. I'm going to do another video at some point about museums that don't, but most museums do allow you to take photographs, and you can get yourself some original reference photographs taken by yourself that show how something was particularly painted, the proper colours for it, or little items of detail that you can capture on your camera. Vehicles often look very different when you see them for real than when you see them in a book, for instance. You know, I mean, I'm a great believer in collecting reference works like the Ospreys and the Blandford Guides and things like that, but often seeing them in reality, the colours are a bit different. You know, there's different examples of camouflage patterns, for instance. Uniforms are often a different colour, some of that's age, but you know, there's plenty of examples that you can see in a museum that aren't necessarily reflected in all the books. You can collect all the books in the world and you probably won't see that example, for instance. Another good example would be being able to see camouflage patterns for real. You know, to see them in real detail with your own two eyes can be very useful when you're going back and trying to recreate that on a model. And another thing that I think is missed a lot is that particularly little regimental museums often have original flags and insignia. You know, these aren't always replicated in books, or at least if they are, they can be quite hard to find. And you know, they're often very well preserved and quite interesting to look at. And of course, they often come with original battle damage, which in itself can be very interesting to see. And another thing to bear in mind is that museums are constantly evolving their understanding of their specialist subjects. So if they find, for instance, that the camouflage pattern they have on a vehicle is wrong, they'll change it. You know, if they get extra information about an artifact, it will be recognised in the information that's being displayed. And obviously, a book is just a snapshot in a particular point in time, and some information can go out of date. And obviously online you have to treat everything with a little bit of caution. So I would highly recommend a museum because it's always going to be the most up to date, and certainly the staff there will be able to answer questions with the most up to date information and research that they have available about their particular specialist subject. Another benefit of visiting museums is that you can often see really good models and dioramas on display, many of them very large and very, very impressive and very inspiring. You know, I've seen some really good battle dioramas, some poor obviously, they're not always the same quality, but you know, there's some really good ones out there in museums that can be very good, interesting to look at. They're often using figures that we would use as wargamers, and you know, bespoke terrain obviously, and some of them are really very good indeed. Some even come with interactive displays. You know, you press the button and a bit lights up and it tells you information about it. They're the best ones, to be honest, because obviously they're a teaching tool for a museum, so a really good way of getting children involved, for instance. You know, when you see a really good battle diorama, the kids instantly enjoy that sort of thing. They like those sort of models and toys, you know, and being able to see them like that is just, you know, very impressive and very inspiring. You know, and museums will often have, you know, model reproductions of forts, battles, infantry figures and things like that. So they're always worth looking out for and taking photographs of, because they're quite interesting reference, as well as I said, being very inspiring. But there's also examples, for instance, of original wartime training models. So for instance, the Airborne Museum that's within Imperial War Museum at Duxford, they've got some of the original training boards used by the Airborne during the Second World War, including the one for Operation Dead Stick, the coup de main attack on Pegasus Bridge, and the two crossings that were there. So they've got the original training board in its 3D with all the detail, and that is really interesting to see. An enormous amount of detail there, and to know that the original men that were going to go into action were looking at that board and using that as their training and deciding where they were going to come in from and so on. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating, and they've been wonderfully preserved and are on display in that little museum, so well worth going to see. And then of course there's things like the Waterloo Uncovered diorama, which is currently being put together, that's going to be at the National Army Museum. I mean, they're talking about bringing that out in sections and doing, each, Le Hay Saint and Hougoumont and so on, and eventually having the whole thing on display. It may take years for them to finalise that project, but at a scale of 1 figure to 3, it's going to be very impressive indeed, and something that I think anyone who's interested in that period is going to want to see. So, museums are really good places to check out good models and dioramas, and that can help you not only with your own painting, but also to give you that inspiration to work on your own project. Another thing that I think is also worth considering is that when you go to a museum, you're often seeing items that have been preserved historically. In other words, they don't repair damage. So they will show, for instance, a uniform that has actual wear and tear and discoloration from use. Bloodstains, for instance. I've mentioned the Engineers Museum at Chatham. They have a map of the Waterloo that was made by the engineers prior to the battle, and it has the bloodstains of Wellington's aide-de-camp who was carrying it when he was shot. I mean, that's a real tangible link to a moment in a major battle, and very inspiring to see. But also you've got other items, like for instance the Tiger tank at Boverton Tank Museum. They have preserved the battle damage that was on that tank when it was captured, including the ricochet underneath the barrel where a shot, possibly from a Churchill tank, but certainly from a British tank, ricocheted off the underside of the gun barrel and stuck in the turret ring and stopped the turret from moving, and possibly is why the crew of that Tiger abandoned it before it was captured. That level of detail, that little bit of damage, tells a story in its own right. But then you flip round and look at the back end of the tank as well, it tells another story. Across the back of the tank there's loads of damage from shrapnel. I'll try and put a picture up here to show what I mean. And it shows that tank was coming under sustained HE fire as well. And if the crew in that tank were inexperienced or already shaken by other hits on the tank, maybe that was enough to get them to leg it. Despite the fact that they were inside a Tiger tank. So that sort of detail was very interesting, particularly if you like recreating battle damage and wear on tanks. So you can often see vehicles that have got original paintwork that is real, that you can replicate on your models. And as I've already mentioned, uniforms will have wear, battle repairs, a uniform with a patch on, it gives you some ideas. What sort of colour patch did they use? Did they try and go for the same colour material, or did they just use whatever they had available? Always worth and interesting to see when you're trying to recreate your little metal men, and paint them up to be accurate. Something else to consider with museums is the fact that they are centres of learning and knowledge for that particular period, their niche. They are the experts. They have a depth of understanding of their subject that maybe can't be gleaned by the average person, and would take most of us a long time to gather together with our own research. A lot can be got from a book, but also a lot can be got from a museum. They will show the small scale story and how it fits into the larger picture. They will have large maps and just because they're obviously trying to tell the story of a period or an event or a battle, but they're trying to do it in a way that gives you the big picture, so that you get that overall understanding of a period or an event. Some museums have their own libraries and research centres. So I know, for instance, the Tank Museum has an excellent library. I've not used it myself, but I've heard a lot of people talking about it. And I know they have a lot of original material there that you can see. And other museums have the same. I've visited plenty of regimental museums which have their own research facilities, obviously for members of the regiment and other historians. And so they may well have a lot of information that isn't documented elsewhere. I mean, in this internet age, it's cool to think that everything's online, but actually everything isn't. And so, if you're developing a relationship with a particular museum and on a particular subject, you may be able to gain access to their research materials that you wouldn't be able to get anywhere else. A museum can help you to give you unique information, unique insight that probably couldn't be found in a book elsewhere. And obviously, as well, I would always recommend don't forget to talk to staff and volunteers. They often know little details that aren't represented in the information, in little information packs that go with equipment and items on display and artifacts and so on. They often know a lot more and have a lot more depth of understanding, so it's well worth chatting to them. And do you know what? I've often found that they're modelers and gamers themselves, and so they don't look funny at you when you say, well, I'm researching this for a war game, or I'm interested in the history. You know, they're often more than happy to talk. They're like any enthusiast, they do like to talk about their subject, so tap them for information. Museums also often have hands-on exhibits that are worth looking at. You know, for instance, you get to feel the weight of chainmail or hold a Panzerfaust. You get to look through the sights of a Pak 40. You know, particularly if you go to living history events, you can handle and see pieces of equipment being used, albeit some of them might be replicas. You know, when you go, for instance, I'm always talking about the Tank Museum, but you know, you go to the Tank Museum on one of their open days when they've got vehicles running, there's nothing quite like feeling the vibrant roar of a tank engine as it rumbles past. It puts you right there in that moment in history. Always worth trying to seek out those sort of things at a museum, because they're things that you can't get from a book or a YouTube video. And I would always say to you, don't miss out on special exhibitions. Many museums, particularly the big ones, but a lot of small ones as well, will do special exhibitions where they bring out part of their collection to show off something that isn't normally on display. So special exhibitions are well worth looking out for. And many museums also do things like lectures and open days where they show off stuff that isn't normally on display because they may have a lack of space or so on. So it's well worth keeping an eye out for those sort of events. Obviously it's very difficult at the moment. Many museums are having restrictions on what they can and can't do due to COVID. But you know, at some point in the future things will settle back down into their normal pattern and events and special exhibitions will resume, and it's worth keeping an eye out for them. One of the other advantages of a special exhibition is they're nearly always accompanied by a book. You know, something that they're trying to sell at the same time, a new piece of research that has come out, and they do a special exhibition to talk about that piece of research and their findings, and it's normally a new book. And that's you know, you can often get access to those things before they're published widely. So that's another thing to remember. You know, when a special exhibition is on, you may be able to get early access to information that hasn't become widely available yet. So, having talked for far too long, I just wanted to conclude by saying, remember, I really do think that a good museum is worth its weight in reference books. You know, they can inspire and connect us to history. We can take personalised reference photos there when we're there. We can often see amazing models and dioramas on display. We get to see actual battle damage and wear on equipment and on uniforms. And we get to learn from the experts in their field. And often we can get up close and personal with stuff that's going to inspire us and help us with our modelling and our wargaming. So go back to my original title, I really do think that a museum is more than worth its weight in reference books. Well, I hope you enjoyed that video, and as always I'd say that if you did, please hit the like button and of course consider hitting the subscribe button. So until next week, I hope that you're all staying well, getting in as many games as you can in whatever format that you're allowed, you know, whether that's over Zoom or doing it solo. And of course, whatever you're playing, keep rolling high.